Good evening and happy snow day to everybody. Well, since we didn't have class today, I spent some time setting up files for everybody so that we could look at this third version of using the existing wood that we're thinking about. And I'll be posting a snow day update for our project, in which we're going to be doing one of 3 types of projects. Everybody's going to be modeling all 3, but then we'll pick one to pursue. So the other 2 we talked about in class on Tuesday, the profiling and then that kind of deep contouring and laying up the slabs of wood. But this one was just something that it seemed like everybody was excited to photograph the pieces of wood, map it out, and maybe start to get into some surface generation or some engraving based on the actual qualities of the real real pieces of wood. So this is actually one of the joys and challenges of working with existing pieces of wood that we're going to find out as we go along. So I think one thing is everybody's going to have to photograph their actual pieces of wood, bring it into Rhino as a picture frame, size it to the real size of the real piece of wood, and then really start to map out where you have some of these splits and some of these knots. And that's going to be true for any of the types of material explorations that you do, because we're going to at least want to be aware of where those are so that we're not mistakenly thinking we have a solid piece when in fact it's going to break in half or have a big knot fly out of it. But what I was doing today was setting up some grasshopper scripts to pattern on the surface of these pieces with the idea that you would really be harvesting this information. So if you take a piece of wood and you map out some points, in this case I just chose a few points on little and big knots here, and then in Rhino create a surface on top of where your image is. And then in this first one, which is called grid spreading, I'm going to show you what this is going to look like, and then we'll back it out and just walk through the definition really quick. Okay, so it's going to look something like this, and you have a couple of control points on it. So the main thing is you're going to set your surface over here, and then you're going to plug in your points here from your wood or any other interesting features that you find as you map it out. So you have some control here in terms of the level of density of the subdivided surface, which is sort of like a grid you're creating here. Okay. And then over here in the middle you actually have a gate that I've created, and the gate is essentially, if you set it to 0, it'll just pass through the information that relates to the vertical lines, which I don't think would, well, you could try it, might be interesting. I'm personally more drawn to going with the grain, which are these horizontal lines. Not sure you would want to really grid out your piece, but number 2 gives you both sets of lines so you can compare. For now I'm just going to stay with number 1. So what you're really doing here is you're subdividing this surface. Let's take a look at what that looks like. Okay, and then what you're doing is you're drawing lines between all those points. So let's unpreview that. And then you're dividing up those lines, and you have a slider here that gives you some resolution there. Let's turn that off for the moment. Then what you're doing, here's where you're plugging in this cloud, you're plugging in the spread points, or the points on the surface that you want to work with. Let's turn this off for the moment. And essentially what it's doing, it's comparing the closest point to all of those points in your grid that you've created to each of these essentially attractor points. And then you're giving it a certain distance here, and it's taking all the small numbers, throwing them out, and then the big numbers it's dispatching to the next bit to keep going if it's bigger. Then it takes those, it looks for the closest points there, and then it basically starts to look and says anything that's within the radius, it's going to kick it out to the edge. And so you can see here it starts to kick those out to the edge. Here, let's close this down. But they're pretty kinky there. So basically once you come over here in the divide curve area, you have an opportunity to get a little bit more resolution. So that's what's going on there, is you're creating more points, and the number of points starts to determine how refined that curve is. So let's turn that off, turn that off, turn that off. I've left panels with descriptions all along the way. The main thing you would really just want to pay attention to is these sliders where you have some controls, and plugging in your points and in your surface. So there, and then just deciding which direction you want to go in. So that's the file that's going to be called Old Wood Grid Spreading, and you can get greater density of lines here when you get to the V direction. So it's pretty gorgeous. And then basically after that you would start to follow the other video that we had done about turning lines from Rhino into regions to do engraving, and that video is also on the blog. So let's move to the other option that I've set up here, which is using attractors. So in this case, what I've actually done on this surface is drawn a line, roughly the idea that you would have some sort of a split in the wood. Here I've gone a little bit more curvy just so you'd be able to see the impact of what we're doing. But essentially over here on the left side of this definition, you're going to set your surface again, and it's really the same thing where you're dividing up the surface. Here we're going to set one surface, set that, then I'm going to set this curve which I've drawn. Okay. And then in this case, I'm subdividing the surface, you can see here, into a grid. So I'm making a whole bunch of little surfaces. And then on the curve, what I'm actually doing is I'm dividing up the curve and I'm putting points. So instead of the 4 or 5 points that I had in the last example down here, I actually have points that are spaced along the line. So you can use this slider to control the number of points that we're talking about. Alternately, if you just have a few points that you want to use, you can just set your multiple points here and then plug this right into the two places where these points are plugged in. So one is right here on the closest point, and the other one is... So essentially what we have here is we have our subdivided surface, and then what we're going to do, in this case, I'll show you the end result. What I've really set up are a bunch of lines, and it's really just a pattern that you can make. So the way that I have it set up basically takes the points from the center of each of these subsurfaces, and then it takes the points from the divided line and it compares them. And what it does is it starts to move and rotate the subsurfaces based on their relationship, the distance between each of the centers of each of those subsurfaces and the points on the curve. So what you're seeing here is each of those little surfaces, remember we had the surfaces back here, right? Each of them has been rotated, and they've actually also been scaled. So let's actually look at that first. So the first thing is based on the distance between the center of each of those original surfaces and the relationship to the closest point on the subdivided line. Each of these little surfaces has been scaled based on that kind of intensity of the relationship. So you have some controls here. You can see as we go up, those surfaces get bigger. When we're down below 1, they're smaller than their original. So let's just play with that there. And then each of those scaled surfaces has now been rotated. Over here, and what it's basically doing is it's looking at the lines, the vectors that go from the center of each of the surfaces. So here's the surfaces down to those control points. So there's two things that are going on here. First, based on the relationship between the center and the point, it's scaling it, and then what it's doing is it's drawing a vector from the center of each of these to the nearest point, and then it's looking at how that vector compares to the x-axis, which is essentially 0. So basically based on that, it's going to rotate each of these surfaces. So let's turn off the scaled one for the moment. Let's turn off our lines and turn on the rotate. So what's happening there is each of these have already been scaled and now they're being rotated. And so up here you just have a little bit of control. If you're at 1, you're essentially at the degree of intensity based on the direct relationship between the vectors. If you want a little more control here though, you can start to play around with this and just multiply the level of intensity. So let's keep it down by 1 for the moment just so we can see what that really looks like. And then the last thing is I took each of those little surfaces and I took 2 corners of it. So a little bit of control here. Let's turn this off for a sec. So what we're doing here is we're grabbing these corner points and then we're drawing a line between them. So the last thing that you have control of, let's turn off the surfaces, is where these lines are drawn. So what you can see here is it starts in the bottom corner and it's drawing a line up to the next corner, and then the next corner, and then the next corner. And so you have some control here too, just to develop some patterns if you want to connect any 2 of those corners and see what kind of patterns you get. So once you get something that you're interested in, let's say that one appeals to you, corner 1 to corner 3, then you can start to come in here and look at the rotation on that or the scaling on that. You can start to get some pretty intense and interesting patterns. Then what we can do is go back, turn off that divide, turn off the curve, go into Rhino, turn these things off, and start to take a look at what that looks like. So you have some refinement that you can play with here based on the way that you're gridding out the surface. You have some refinement here based on how many points it's trying to connect to. You have some refinement here based on the scaling. Over here, whether you want more or less rotation. And then over here based on which of the corners is actually connected. So that's a lot of fun controls. After you're done with this, the same as the other one, you can bake these lines and then using the other video, bring them into RhinoCam as regions and engrave them. That's all for tonight. I hope everybody's warm and toasty, and I'll see you next week.